The rifle was heavier than sin in Caleb's hands. Arizona Territory, 1881. The boy, barely 14, stared up at him, eyes wide and pleading. The dust devils danced in the street, mocking Caleb's hesitation. "He needs it, Caleb." Ezekiel Marsh's voice was a low growl, the stagecoach driver's words like stones in his gut. Caleb looked at the boy again, Thomas, all elbows and fear. He looked at the gathering crowd, their faces tight with anticipation, and the dread clamped down harder. He thought of his wife, Mary, buried these past 3 years. She would have known what to do. The sun beat down, unforgiving. He hadn't heard a church bell in months. Caleb gripped the rifle tighter. It was a Winchester Model 1873, a beauty, but a tool of death nonetheless. He'd promised Mary he was done with killing. He'd come to this God-forsaken territory to escape the past, not repeat it. "He's just a boy, Zeke," Caleb muttered, but Marsh just spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "He's all that stands between us and the ranch hands' renegades." Marsh's words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. "Unless you aim to take his place." The crowd murmured agreement. Caleb knew what they wanted. They wanted blood. They wanted revenge for the raided homesteads, the stolen cattle, the lives lost. He smelled the fear and anger radiating off them like heat from a forge. Caleb swallowed hard, the metallic tang of fear coating his tongue. He looked at Thomas again. The boy's knuckles were white as he reached for the rifle. "Teach him to use it right, Caleb." Marsh clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a brand. "Teach him to kill." Caleb felt a coldness settle in his bones. He knew what he had to do. He showed Thomas how to shoulder the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger, not jerk it. The boy was a quick study, fear sharpening his senses. The next morning, Caleb awoke to silence. An unnatural silence. He usually heard the creak of wagons, the braying of mules, the distant yip of coyotes. Now, nothing. He threw on his boots and stumbled out of his ramshackle cabin. The air was still, heavy, with the promise of another sweltering day. The only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. He walked towards the center of town, his gut twisting with each step. The street was deserted. The saloon doors hung open, swaying gently in the breeze. The smell of stale beer and something else, something acrid and metallic, hung in the air. Then he saw them. They lay scattered in the dust, like discarded dolls. Men, women, children, all dead. The sun glinted off the empty brass casings of the Winchester. Caleb stumbled forward, his mind reeling. He saw Marsh, lying sprawled in front of the saloon, his face frozen in a mask of surprise. He saw the storekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, clutching a bolt of calico, her eyes wide with terror. He saw Thomas. The boy stood in the middle of the street, the rifle still clutched in his hands. His face was blank, devoid of emotion. He looked like a ghost, a pale specter haunting the ruins of the town. Caleb heard the faint buzzing of flies. "Thomas," Caleb croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "What have you done?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Caleb approached him slowly, cautiously. He reached out a hand, but Thomas flinched away. "They were going to hurt me," the boy said, his voice flat and toneless. "They said I had to kill the Indians. I didn't want to, so I killed them first." Caleb stared at him, horror washing over him in waves. He had given a rifle to a boy, and the boy had used it to slaughter an entire town. He tasted bile in the back of his throat. But why, Thomas? Why everyone? Caleb asked, his voice cracking. They were all the same, the boy said, his eyes still vacant. They all wanted blood. They all wanted to kill. Caleb knew then that he had made a terrible mistake. He had thought he was saving the town by giving Thomas the rifle. He had thought he was protecting them from the Indians. But he had only unleashed a far greater evil. He remembered Mary's words, spoken so long ago. Mercy is always the answer, Caleb. Even when it's hard. He hadn't listened. He had chosen revenge over compassion, fear over faith. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying the scent of death. He looked at Thomas again. The boy was still clutching the rifle, his face a mask of innocence and horror. Caleb knew he couldn't leave him here. He couldn't abandon him to the wolves, both literal and figurative. He reached out and gently took the rifle from Thomas's hands. The boy didn't resist. Caleb felt the weight of the weapon, the weight of his own guilt, pressing down on him. "Come on, Thomas," Caleb said, his voice weary but firm. "We're leaving this place." They walked away from the town, leaving the dead behind. They walked towards the mountains, towards the setting sun. Caleb didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The silence of the dead town echoed in his ears. As they walked, Caleb thought about Mary. He thought about her kindness, her compassion, her unwavering faith. He thought about his own failures, his own weaknesses. He thought about the cycle of violence that had consumed him, that had consumed this town, that threatened to consume everything. He knew he had a long road ahead of him. He knew he had to find a way to break the cycle, to teach Thomas the difference between right and wrong, to show him the power of mercy. The rough fabric of his shirt scratched against his skin. But he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The past was a heavy burden, and the future was uncertain. But he had to try. He owed it to Mary, he owed it to Thomas, and he owed it to himself. He could hear the distant call of a hawk. They walked for days, following the winding trails through the mountains. Caleb taught Thomas how to hunt, how to build a fire, how to survive in the wilderness. He also tried to teach him about compassion, about forgiveness, about the value of life. Thomas was a slow learner. He was still haunted by the memory of the massacre, still scarred by the violence he had witnessed and committed. The drifter persevered. He knew that Thomas was his responsibility, his chance to redeem himself. The smell of pine filled the air. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, Caleb told Thomas about Mary. He told him about her kindness, her generosity, her unwavering faith. He told him about how she had always seen the good in people, even when they didn't see it in themselves. Thomas listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the flames. The widow finished. He looked up at him, his face troubled. "Did she forgive you?" Thomas asked. Caleb hesitated. He didn't know if Mary had forgiven him. He didn't know if he deserved to be forgiven. But he knew he had to try. "I hope so, Thomas," Caleb said, his voice soft. "I hope she knew that I was trying to be a better man." Thomas nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else, but Caleb could see a flicker of hope in his eyes. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the night sky. A few weeks later, they came across a small settlement, a cluster of cabins nestled in a fertile valley. The settlers were wary at first, but Caleb managed to convince them that he and Thomas meant no harm. He and Thomas stayed in the settlement for a while, helping the settlers with their chores, learning their ways. Caleb found himself drawn to the simple life, the sense of community, the shared struggle against the harshness of the land. He heard children laughing. He even started to feel a glimmer of hope that he could find peace in this place, that he could finally escape the shadows of his past. But his peace was not to last. One day, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. They were led by a man in a dusty black coat. He was known only as the deputy. Caleb recognized him immediately. He was the man who had chased him across 3 states, the man who had sworn to bring him to justice for his past sins. The deputy dismounted and strode towards Caleb, his face grim. "Caleb," the deputy said, his voice cold and hard. "It's over. You can't run anymore." Caleb knew he was right. He had been running for too long. It was time to face his past. He turned to Thomas, who was standing beside him, his face pale with fear. "Thomas," Caleb said, his voice firm, "you need to leave. Go back to the mountains. Find a new life." "But what about you?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. "Don't worry about me," Caleb said. "I'll be all right. Just promise me you'll never forget what I taught you." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. He turned and ran, disappearing into the trees. Caleb turned back to the deputy, his face resolute. "I'm ready," Caleb said. The deputy smiled, a cruel, humorless smile. "It's about time," he said. They rode away, leaving the settlement behind. Caleb knew he was riding towards his death, but he also knew that he had done everything he could to protect Thomas, to give him a chance at a better life. He could feel the sun on his face. As they rode, Caleb thought about Mary. He thought about her love, her forgiveness, her unwavering faith. He knew that she would be proud of him, that she would be waiting for him on the other side. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was ready. The deputy led him to a desolate canyon, a place where the wind howled and the shadows danced. He dismounted and motioned for Caleb to do the same. Caleb dismounted and stood facing the deputy, his face calm and resolute. "Any last words?" the deputy asked, his hand hovering over his gun. Caleb looked up at the sky, at the vast expanse of blue that stretched out above him. He thought about Mary, about Thomas, about all the people he had loved and lost. "Mercy," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. The deputy hesitated for a moment, his face troubled. Then he shook his head and drew his gun. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. Caleb felt a sharp pain in his chest, and then everything went black. He smelled gunpowder. He fell to the ground, his body limp and lifeless. The deputy stood over him for a moment, his face grim. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Caleb's body to rot in the sun. The sun set on the Arizona territory, casting long shadows across the land. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of death and despair. The rifle lay beside him, cold and silent. Somewhere in the mountains, a boy was running. He carried with him the memory of a man who had tried to do the right thing, a man who had given him a chance at a better life. The silence of the desert held its breath. The deputy rode back to town, the setting sun painting long, distorted shadows that mirrored the unease in his gut. He wasn't a good man, not by any stretch of the imagination. He'd done things he wasn't proud of, things that gnawed at him in the dead of night. But killing Caleb, that felt different. It felt wrong. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the familiar sounds of drunken laughter and piano music grating on his ears. He tied his horse to the rail and stepped inside, the smoky air thick with the smell of whiskey and sweat. He needed a drink, several of them. He found a table in the corner, away from the boisterous crowd, and signaled to the bartender. A shot of whiskey arrived quickly, and he downed it in one gulp, the burning liquid doing little to soothe the turmoil inside him. He ordered another, and another, the amber liquid blurring the edges of his conscience. He tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. Caleb was a criminal, a murderer. He'd deserved what he got. But the image of Caleb's face, calm and resolute even in the face of death, haunted him. The whispered word, mercy, echoed in his ears. He stayed in the saloon until closing time, the whiskey numbing his senses, but not his guilt. He stumbled out into the cool night air, the silence of the town amplifying the hollowness within him. He walked towards his small, sparsely furnished house, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He tossed and turned in his bed, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Caleb's face. He saw the canyon, the gun, the lifeless body lying in the dust. He heard the echo of the gunshot, the whispered plea for mercy. Finally, as the first rays of dawn crept through the window, he rose, exhausted and defeated. He splashed water on his face, trying to clear his head. He needed to get out of town, to escape the suffocating guilt that was consuming him. He packed a small bag, grabbed his rifle, and saddled his horse. He rode out of town without a word to anyone, heading west, towards the setting sun. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He needed to find a place where he could forget, where he could escape the memory of Caleb and the weight of his own actions. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He wandered aimlessly, drifting from town to town, working odd jobs, always moving on before anyone got too close. He drank heavily, trying to drown his sorrows, but the guilt always remained, a constant companion. He saw the ghost of Caleb everywhere he went. He saw him in the faces of the men he met, in the vastness of the desert, in the silence of the night. He couldn't escape him. Caleb had become a part of him, a permanent stain on his soul. One day, he found himself in a small, dusty town, not unlike the one he had left behind. He was sitting in a saloon, nursing a drink, when he overheard a conversation at the next table. Two men were talking about a boy who had been seen in the mountains, a boy who was said to be skilled with a rifle and wise beyond his years. The deputy froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew who they were talking about. It was Thomas. He had survived. He had found his way to a new life. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. Relief that Thomas was alive and well. Guilt that he had orphaned him. A strange sense of pride that Caleb's teachings had helped him survive. He knew he should stay away, that his presence would only bring trouble. But he couldn't resist the urge to see Thomas, to make sure he was truly all right. He left the saloon and saddled his horse. He rode towards the mountains, driven by a desperate hope and a deep-seated fear. He knew that finding Thomas could be the end of him, but he couldn't stay away. He had to see him, even if it was just for a moment. He had to know that Caleb's sacrifice had not been in vain. The mountains loomed ahead, promising both solace and peril. The deputy urged his horse onward, the rocky terrain growing steeper with each passing mile. The sun beat down mercilessly, but he barely noticed, his mind consumed by the thought of Thomas. He imagined the boy, older now, hardened by the wilderness, perhaps even resentful. Could he blame him? He had taken away his father, his home, his life. He rode for 2 days, following the faint trails and asking discreet questions in the sparse settlements he encountered. Most people were wary of strangers, but a few, drawn in by his quiet demeanor and the glint of desperation in his eyes, offered snippets of information. They spoke of a young man living alone in a secluded cabin high in the peaks, a boy who hunted with uncanny skill and kept to himself. The descriptions matched Thomas. Finally, he reached a narrow valley, the air cooler and the scent of pine thick in the air. A thin wisp of smoke curled upwards from a chimney in the distance. He dismounted, tethering his horse to a scrubby tree, and continued on foot, his rifle held loosely in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the mountains. He approached the cabin cautiously, his senses on high alert. It was a simple structure, built of logs and stone, nestled against a rocky outcrop. A small garden lay to one side, filled with herbs and vegetables. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency and a life lived in harmony with nature. He stopped a few yards from the door, his throat suddenly dry. He didn't know what to say, how to explain himself. He was a ghost from the past, a reminder of a pain he had inflicted. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. Suddenly the door swung open. A young man stood there, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the butt of a rifle. He was taller than the deputy remembered, his face leaner, his eyes sharper. But there was no mistaking him. It was Thomas. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice low and wary. The deputy swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Thomas," he said. Recognition flickered in Thomas's eyes, followed by a wave of emotions he couldn't decipher. Shock, anger, confusion, perhaps even a hint of sadness. "You," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "What are you doing here?" The deputy took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I came to see you," he said. "To see if you were all right." "All right?" Thomas scoffed. "You left me alone. You killed my father." The words hit the deputy like a physical blow. He flinched, the guilt he had carried for so long now, a crushing weight. "I know," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising. "My father is dead because of you. My life is ruined because of you." "I know," the deputy said again, his head bowed. "I can't undo what I've done. But I wanted to see you. To know that you were safe. That you were surviving." Thomas stared at him, his eyes filled with a burning intensity. "I don't need you," he said. "I don't want you here. Get out." The deputy nodded slowly, his heart sinking. He had expected this, perhaps even deserved it. "All right," he said. "I'll go." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, his spirit broken. But as he turned, he saw something in Thomas's eyes, a flicker of something beyond anger and resentment. A hint of vulnerability, a glimpse of the boy he once was. He stopped, his hand resting on the hilt of his rifle. "Thomas," he said, his voice stronger now. "I know I can't make up for what I've done. But if you ever need anything, anything at all, you can find me. I'll be there." Thomas didn't reply, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The deputy waited for a moment, then turned and walked away, back towards his horse, back towards the uncertain future that awaited him. He didn't know if he had done the right thing, if he had helped or hurt Thomas even more. But he knew one thing: he would never stop regretting the choices he had made, the life he had taken, the boy he had orphaned. And he would always be ready to answer if Thomas ever called. He mounted his horse, turned him west, and rode on, the mountains looming behind him, a silent testament to his guilt and his enduring hope. Hope. Wah. It was a dangerous thing, the deputy thought, especially for a man like him. Hope could be a noose, tightening around your neck with every breath. He rode for hours, the sun dipping lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful spectacle that did nothing to soothe the turmoil in his gut. He reached the small town as darkness was settling. It wasn't much, a cluster of buildings huddled together against the vastness of the landscape. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a few scattered houses. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the swinging doors creaking open as he pushed through. The air inside was thick with smoke and the murmur of conversations, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. He found a table in a corner, ordered a whiskey, and sat nursing the drink, lost in his thoughts. He saw faces he knew, men he had worked with, men he had once considered friends. But tonight, he felt like an outsider, a ghost haunting a world that no longer belonged to him. He finished his whiskey and ordered another. The alcohol numbed the edges of his guilt, but it also amplified his loneliness. He wondered what Thomas was doing, if he was safe, if he was warm. He wondered if Thomas would ever forgive him. A figure approached his table, casting a long shadow in the dim light. It was Jed, a grizzled old prospector with a face etched with the hardships of the West. Jed pulled up a chair without asking. His eyes narrowed in a way that made the deputy uneasy. "Heard you were back," Jed said, his voice raspy. The deputy nodded, taking another sip of his whiskey. "Just passing through." Jed chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Passing through, huh? Or checking up on the boy?" The deputy's hand tightened around his glass. "What do you know about the boy?" "Word travels fast in these parts," Jed said. "Especially when it involves a dead man and a lawman with a guilty conscience." The deputy glared at Jed, his anger rising to the surface. "You watch your mouth, old man." Jed held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just speaking the truth. Folks are talking, that's all. Some are saying you did the right thing. Others are saying you should be hanging from the nearest tree." "And what do you say?" the deputy asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jed leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. "I say you made a mistake. A big one. But I also say that everyone deserves a second chance. Even a lawman who kills a man in cold blood." The deputy stared at Jed, surprised by his words. He had expected condemnation, not understanding. "But," Jed continued, his voice hardening, "that second chance comes with a price. You owe that boy. You owe him more than just a roof over his head and food in his belly. You owe him your protection. You owe him your guidance. You owe him a life." The deputy nodded slowly, the weight of Jed's words settling on him. He knew Jed was right. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he could try to make amends. He could try to be the father figure that Thomas had lost. "I know," the deputy said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know." Jed nodded, satisfied. He stood up, his joints creaking. "Just remember what I said, deputy. That boy is all alone in the world. He needs someone to look out for him. And if you don't, someone else will." Jed turned and walked away, leaving the deputy alone with his thoughts. He finished his whiskey, the taste bitter on his tongue. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just ride away and leave Thomas to fend for himself. He had to stay. He had to protect him. He had to try to make up for the sins of his past. He stood up, paid for his drinks, and walked out of the saloon. The night air was cold and crisp, the stars shining brightly in the sky. He walked to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode out of town, back towards the mountains, back towards Thomas. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going anywhere. He was staying. The drifter. For himself. For a chance at redemption. He spurred his horse onward. The hope, that dangerous, fragile thing, flickering in his chest. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction.